So we got Leigh Whannell's Wolfman movie finally. This has been one of my most anticipated movies of the year, and it's looking like it came out and just was dead on arrival. It's not doing very well at the box office. It seems like the critics are being pretty hard on it. They don't seem to be enjoying it. Spoilers, by the way, for this whole video. I'm going to be going into a lot of plot points that are definitely spoilers, deeper themes in the movie. But overall, I get why other people didn't enjoy this movie, why it didn't resonate with a lot of people, and why the reaction is so mixed. And I'd even agree with some of the criticisms, but I personally found the movie to actually be pretty good, definitely emotionally resonant, and I kind of wanted to talk about some of those themes that I found to be emotionally resonant, because I really do think that I'm on the other side of this one. Everybody else seems to not be enjoying it, very disappointed, a lot of people claiming it to be Leigh Whannell's worst movie, and if you feel that way, fair enough, I'm not going to take it away from you, but overall, I kind of want to get into what I found compelling about this movie, what I found to be good, and explain that a bit more, get into it a little bit. So we're going to be talking about the deeper themes of Leigh Whannell's Wolfman. And basically at the corner, the center of this story is this idea of being afraid of ending up like your parents. Repeating negative or toxic cycles that, are something that you could potentially inherit from a parent, repeating certain behaviors, and how in an attempt to not scar your children, you could eventually be that monster that you yourself fear. And I think that this is done in a very interesting way in The Wolfman. The beginning of the movie sets this all up by showing Blake's upbringing with his father, and it actually is a little bit understated. I know that some people are kind of ripping on the movie for the fact that his dad seems like kind of just more of a stern dad than an actual abuser or anything, but I think it's just that they didn't show that. I think that they were going for a little bit more subtlety. That's just kind of how I interpreted it, that rather than having this very over-the-top moment where he just berates him, smacks him around, he's just a very cold, clearly military-oriented guy that is way too rough with Blake, but at the same time he still obviously cares about him, but he ultimately scares Blake, and that's what eventually drives him away, why he hasn't kept in contact with him for years. But it isn't very cartoonish, and that I kind of appreciated a bit about it. I'm glad that it stuck to show don't tell. You definitely see this idea that Blake's father, out of fear of his son getting hurt, definitely scars him, definitely scares him, and that's something that's going to be brought up later in the movie, something that will come full circle. Because when you cut to Blake as an adult, he's basically the total opposite of his dad. His dad seemed very distant with Blake. It seemed like, although he cared about him, he was extremely tough on him, and there was no softness or gentleness there, just pretty much this whole idea of him training Blake to take care of himself, and that's it. And then when you cut to Blake as an adult, you see that he's pretty much adopted this soft stay-at-home dad persona. It pretty concisely conveys exactly Blake's dynamic with his daughter and his daughter's dynamic with his mother, Blake's wife. And you see that while Blake's wife is a bit more of the cold, distant working parent, that Blake's the one that pretty much takes care of her, is the main parental figure in her life, and that's why they have such a deep and close connection. But they also kind of show the cracks in that Blake isn't this perfect dad, and that there is still a bit of his father that kind of ekes out and causes him to be a little bit too rough with her. It's a scene where he very fairly kind of loses it on her, but he just goes a bit too far, and it clearly scares her. And he immediately realizes what he's done and feels instant shame of it because he sees his father's affect in what he does, that loss of control. And he clearly doesn't want to repeat that cycle of anger. He doesn't want to distance himself from his daughter with these personal issues. But as you see later in the movie, that attempt to avoid being like his father has him wound up in the supernatural situation where he does end up just like him. The movie really does harp on this desperation to not scar your kid. You could see with any impact that this story potentially has, Blake is always concerned about what this will do to his daughter. Like when the van crashes and you see Derek get killed by the Wolfman, Blake's immediate fear is that that will emotionally scar his daughter. And with that, we get into the Wolfman himself, or themselves, because this is really where the metaphor kind of gets driven home. But I will say, getting back to where I kind of agree with the criticisms, I feel like when the Wolfman gets involved, this is kind of where the more basic and skin level plot details do get utilized in a way that is a bit generic sometimes. I think that it's definitely the weaker aspects of the movie. Although there's some fun set pieces with them trying to survive, it's easily the most basic part of this movie. Not to say that there's not some good scares, that they don't effectively use the Wolfman's presence. And I like too the way that they show him in flashes and kind of hide him until closer to the end of the movie, because they do hold out on that design for a good amount of the movie. If you're like me and avoided the trailers too, that's definitely worth it. The design is a little bit weird. I think it's a little bit outside the box, but I do appreciate that they did try to do something different rather than make it a very derivative Wolfman. But also going into this, I think that it actually very much effectively drives the themes home, having the Wolfman that initially infects Blake be his father. It makes so much sense when you're telling this story about parents becoming like your parents, that fear of scarring your children because of repeating a cycle of violence or anger that was initially developed in the household of that parent, and having it told through this mechanism of Blake's father being this monster that infects him and turns him into a monster and makes the ultimate choice to sacrifice himself in the end because he'd rather die than scar his child. I think is told incredibly well, and I think just escalates the movie a bit, takes it out of that camp of very basic slasher or monster movie. I think in the same way that Invisible Man tackles relationship dynamics, things like gaslighting, through this supernatural mechanism of an invisible man that's stalking you. This movie really uses the Wolfman kind of as the metaphor for the themes of the story. A little bit similarly, it's kind of a weird comparison, but it reminds me a bit of how they used the Hulk in the Ang Lee 2003 Hulk movie. Because in that movie, the Hulk's not really just the Hulk. He's a metaphor for Bruce's repressed childhood memories, kind of how he's bottled them up and it comes to surface and blows up in the worst possible way as an adult. In that way, it's using this Wolfman curse of basically this passed down cycle of distance, coldness, and anger that goes from Blake's father to him, and him cutting off that cycle by the end before he could infect his daughter or anyone else that he loves. Could it have been executed better? Maybe, but I think that the way that they told it still was rich with substance. I personally just think that it worked for me. Blake becoming the monster that is his father in and of itself uses the story to reinforce what it's trying to tell in the first place. And even though you get to a point in the story where you're like, wait a second, is that Blake's father? And you kind of, I feel like most people might guess it. It still sinks it home with that reveal of the tattoo on his arm, and it brings the visual of Blake becoming what he fears to light in an interesting way. And like I said, all these things just make it much more heartbreaking when Blake ultimately makes that decision at the end of the movie, when he decides to end the cycle, when he decides to allow his wife to take him out and stop himself from continuing this, from infecting the rest. He'd rather be put out of his misery and dead than continue that cycle. And it leaves the movie on a pretty macabre note, I guess is the best way to put it. It's very morbid, but at the same time, I like movies like that that end on a very down note sometimes. Sometimes I think that that makes for the ending of a movie that you walk away remembering. And I don't know if there really is any other way than that to end a story like this. I understand some of the gripes, I understand some of the complaints with him gradually becoming the Wolfman the whole movie, rather than having this interesting, on and off switch. I wish that they were able to show a bit more of his humanity after he gets infected in the back half of the movie, but I still think that they mix it up. I still think that they use the story to its advantage, and for what they were going for, it works for me, but I get why it didn't work for other people. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section. I'd love to hear your thoughts on the Wolfman movie. I'm GM Light. Have a good one.